I'm joined today by retired Seattle Police Chief Norm Stamper, who spent 34 years in law enforcement and now promotes common sense solutions to criminal justice, policing, and drug policy issues as a representative of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. It's so great to speak to you, Norm. I think just to begin with, I'd love to get your general sense of the direction that Jeff Sessions is taking the Justice Department with regard to the war on drugs and enforcement of drug policy. Are you pleased with what you see, or are you concerned?
Well, I'm absolutely not pleased. I think what Jeff Sessions and the entire Trump administration is advocating and, in fact, acting upon is a reversal of very hard fought gains in criminal justice system reform over the last 10, 15 years.
And when we look at, for example, just to pick one issue to dig into a little more specifically, when we look at establishing prison sentences for drug crimes, talk to us about, in your experience in Seattle, what did you see, if anything, in terms of the correlation between harsher sentences for drug crimes and preventing violent drug crime?
I think that distinction is critical. Sessions and others don't seem to want to make that distinction, but it's very important to do so. What I observed in Seattle in my 28 years in the San Diego Police Department before that was that the drug war itself is fundamentally flawed. It is most disastrous social or public policy, in my experience, in this country since slavery. I think what we're seeing is a return to some draconian penalties that will do nothing to enhance public safety or neighborhood health.
It seems that if we sort of divide drug crimes into violent and nonviolent, from what I've read, if you apply harsh sentences to those who commit nonviolent drug related crimes, you actually risk, by the environment that you expose these individuals to, I don't know if radicalizing is the right word, but maybe predisposing them to get involved in more serious crime. And then on the violent drug crime part, it doesn't really appear that the harsh sentences sort of serve as a deterrent. So I'm just not sure in what way we benefit from harsh drug sentences.
I'll take the latter part of that question first.
Okay.
I just don't think it's reasonable for us to think that heads of drug cartels or major traffickers or hand-to-hand dealers in neighborhoods and communities are studying sentencing patterns and informing their choices to engage in that illicit behavior. What they're doing is making massive amounts of money, and the product of an illicit commerce basically is violence. That's inevitable. So what we see really is the fundamental flaw in that policy producing the crime, violence, and other unfortunate social conditions that we see in our neighborhoods. But you're absolutely right. One of the best ways to educate in the ways of accelerating, advancing criminal behavior, those engaged in nonviolent offenses, is to put them in prison, where they're going to learn a ton about how to commit criminal acts, how to disable and disarm police officers. How I've seen this firsthand in San Diego as I visited prisons throughout the state of California a few years back. And one of the things that I think is just vital for us to understand is that the organizing principle behind this country's drug war is prohibition. And we know from literally centuries of experience that prohibition doesn't work, that it can't work. When Nixon famously proclaimed drugs public enemy number one and declared all out war on them, he was really declaring war on his own people, and disproportionately young people, poor people, people of color, the very people in neighborhoods across this country who have had the most difficult time with their local police. So he put domestic peacekeepers on the front line of a drug war. And of course, you don't fight a war without enemies. You don't fight a war, for that matter, without propaganda. In the last 10 years or so, we have become much smarter about the drug war. And we have said that those who are engaged in nonviolent offenses are typically in the midst of a public health issue, and certainly with the opioid crisis, a public health crisis. And if we were to treat drug use, certainly drug abuse, as a medical problem, the medical problem that it is, we'd save a ton of money and we would make our communities safer and healthier.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like at all levels, so many of the interventions that have been attempted by under the umbrella of, I guess, what we would call the war on drugs have just failed to sort of impact the right places or the right people. One example, I recently read this book, Narconomics by Tom Wainwright, which is super interesting. And it talks about the cocaine trade. And it points out, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think in the United States, the street level value of a kilo of cocaine was roughly $100,000 or $120,000. I mean, does that sound roughly right to you?
Yes, it does. One of the
Okay.
things we know is that it fluctuates as a function of supply and demand.
Yeah, so one of the techniques that has been applied in Colombia where coca leaf is grown is to basically burn or destroy the coca leaf plantations. And the amount of coca leaf that you need to end up with that $100,000 kilo of refined cocaine is like a couple $100s. And what the book points out is that even if you burn half the supply of coca leaf in Colombia, effectively doubling the source materials cost from say $200 to $400, it basically has no impact at the street level, right? I mean, it's $120,000 kilo or $120,400 kilo, and you're really affecting farmers in Colombia who are not really the source of the cocaine problem. Is that sort of representative of how the war on drugs has failed? It's sort of impacting the wrong people?
It is, and we need to bear in mind. You talk about Colombia, the Middle East is a hotbed of opium production as well, and you can be sure that the farmers who are growing and harvesting that crop are not being compensated. The Taliban is.
Hmm.
Terrorists who attack this country are in many cases financing their terrorism through, in effect, U.S. drug policy. So if we were to get smart, we would legalize all drugs, however radical that may sound. We would tax and regulate those drugs. So you cannot regulate illicit commerce. But if we were to create a model fundamentally different from the one that has guided us and misguided us for so many decades, we would, in fact, begin to see a major reduction in public air street dealing. We would see an increase in property values in disadvantaged communities. We would see fewer families fractured. We would see enormous improvements in our crime rates. Sessions likes to talk about how crime has skyrocketed in the last year or two. That corresponds directly with the opioid crisis,
Mm,
which began, frankly, in doctors' offices and medicine chests,
right.
and is now spilled out onto the streets. And the problem that exists today exists under current US drug policy. Drugs are more readily available today at lower prices and higher levels of potency than at any time since Nixon declared that war on drugs.
Yeah, it seems if you wanted to go with the first approach, which is sort of try to impact some of the individuals involved in the trade, to stick with the cocaine example, you don't go with the coca leaf growers and you don't go with the street level dealers. You go with sort of the maybe the cartel or the place in the middle where the most cost or is added to the price of cocaine. But you're actually talking about what maybe makes the most sense, which is you just don't treat it as a criminal issue whatsoever. You treat it as an issue of public health. And would you not, I mean, this is sort of, there's disagreement over this, but is your sense, Norm, that when you do legalize, you don't remove all of the power from cartels, but you do remove a lot of it?
You remove their profits. If you were to legalize across the board all drugs, you would almost overnight eliminate that particular problem. The cartels are populated by evil and greedy people, and I have no doubt that they would funnel their activities and their energy and their tactics into other areas, like human trafficking, for example, or gun running, or some other illicit form of commerce. but we could dramatically improve the health of America's cities if we were, in fact, to remove that cartel influence from essentially drug commerce and to regulate it, tax it, which then enables us to control it. And by the way, in offering an agenda of legalization, the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, of which I'm a proud member, and my own experience over the last 50 years in and out of law enforcement, suggests that you concentrate on the behavior. If you've got somebody in a neighborhood who is furnishing to kids, you pop that individual, you arrest that individual, and you apply a rigorous method and policies of prosecution, charging hopefully with conviction, and you make those people who engage in that behavior pay a price.
We've been speaking with retired Seattle Police Chief Norm Stamper. Norm, thanks so much for talking to us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.